cost of renting is officially at crisis point.
Property prices soared by almost 13% last year. That is according to the latest
It takes more than a
national
decade to
figures
save a standard 20% deposit for a house in most Australian capital cities. This report
At
by
least two of our
Totality
main
also
cities are
reveals
entirely
how much people's
unaffordable,
pay
the others not far behind.
The data also shows the markets where it's getting even harder for people to buy a home.
Now, Sydney
where
remains the most
latest
unaffordable city in the country.
We're already in a housing market that's never been this unaffordable.
Housing. It seems everywhere you look, that's all people are talking about. Turn on the news and you'll hear reporters and experts go on and on about rising interest rates, the overcrowded rental market, and the skyrocketing prices of even the most modest houses and apartments. This housing crisis is affecting millions of Australians across the country, and many experts, advocates, and politicians have openly shared their ideas on how to fix this. The thing is, when people talk about housing, they usually talk about first-time buyers or veteran investors. Rarely do we ever hear the role gender plays in housing. And why should we, you may ask? Well, because women's relationship with the housing market is strikingly different from the male experience when you take the time to think about it. From the gender pay gap and the responsibilities of child rearing to the impact health and domestic violence has on their lives, there is an entire galaxy of factors that influence a woman's chances of accessing a home of one's own. I'm Dr. Kate Raynor, the Director of the Centre for Equitable Housing at Per Capita, and I have been researching Australian housing for over a decade. In that time, I have led research projects on older women's homelessness, experiences of stigma and housing satisfaction in public housing, housing stress during COVID-19, access to crisis accommodation for survivors of family violence, just transitions in Australia's renewable energy zones, and perceptions of higher density housing. And in 2026, I'm adding another feather to my cap, podcast host. I'll bring you along my journey as I speak to experts from around the country and the world in an effort to detangle the ongoing housing crisis, but through a gendered lens, in hopes of finding solutions towards a new equitable housing system. What could a gender-equal housing system look like? How would we even know it if we saw it? That's what we'll find out in Season 2 of Homes Not Houses. To kick things off, I was joined by Dr Leonora Risse, an economist who specialises in gender equality. Her research focuses on gender gaps, including the gender pay gap and women's underrepresentation in leadership and decision-making. So, I'd just like to start by asking you what your own relationship is with thinking about economics and gender and housing, if that's relevant as well, and just a little bit about how you ended up working in this area.
Yeah, so I am an economist by training. I love economics. I love the idea that economic tools help us to understand the world. And I guess when I look at the world, a big question for me is why do we have these gender gaps in so many social outcomes, economic outcomes? That curiosity and inquisitiveness really steered me towards economics as a way to kind of make sense of it, and not just make sense of it, but start to interrogate it and start to look at solutions. Often in economics or in broader policy making in the gender equality space, what we look at are those gender gaps in outcomes, like the gender pay gap is a really clear and obvious one, the gender gap in earnings, gender gaps in leadership roles, and they're a clear reflection of a combination of societal factors that, steer people in different ways depending on their gender, but they're also a reflection of how society is structured and set up in a gender hierarchy as well, with different access to power, different norms based on gender. I think in economics, I was trained in what we'd call like mainstream economics, which is kind of focused more on looking at the market, the free market as the solution. And you have to have a really convincing case for why there should be some sort of intervention or government stepping in to the market. But increasingly in my economic studies and practice, it became really clear that conventional economics did not have the solutions or the convincing answers to these questions as to why gender gaps exist. It's not just pure choice, it's not just preferences. There are these social structures and systems behind it. And people who work in sociology, for example, feminist studies, they know all this, they know this, they've been saying this for centuries, but mainstream economics really hasn't. So in my work as an economist, I guess I've tried to stay in that mainstream space, but bring that gender lens into that space and cast a gender lens over our policy making architecture, the data we collect, the way we go about designing a budget, the way we analyse policies. How do we make sure we've got a gender lens on those policies, including, and most importantly, the policies that sound like they have nothing to do with gender, because that's often where these hidden gender biases and gender inequities continue to play out. So yeah, I guess I hope through my work I'm helping to raise awareness of how in economics and our economic policy kit, we still think about gender biases, gender distortions, and we need to very conscientiously cast a gender lens over policies, and housing is definitely one of them. When we see gender gaps in housing ownership or wealth and retirement security, we see that outcome, but it's not just an outcome that pops up overnight. It's a reflection of a whole stream of how people interact with the economy and the opportunities available to them, the way they've been treated or disadvantaged. And this is one of those end outcomes. So we have to track back to realise how the system itself can have these gender biases built into it. And the good news is that we can redesign the system to make it more equitable.
Yeah, I see that. And I guess if we do want to talk about housing as a system within economics and from a mainstream economics perspective, what would a mainstream economist argue is driving the fact that we see different outcomes between men and women around home ownership?
Yes, so mainstream economics would say, well, look, what you see in the market is a reflection of people's choices and preferences. Sort of with a gender lens on that, I think what we're looking at is an economy which has very much been designed around a conventional household structure where you've had two income earners, and in most households, if you're looking at a heterosexual couple, it's the male who's been the main breadwinner, the income earner, and the female who's been the caregiver. And this is, this is not to say there aren't other types of household compositions, but this is, your mainstream default model that the economy is kind of built around. And so the assumption was that over time, with workforce participation, this household would build up enough wealth and income to be able to secure a home. And then the assumption was that would, that family would stay together and grow, and people's housing needs and aspirations would be fulfilled. Obviously, what we see in reality is so many different iterations of how individuals and households, journey through life. And there is really no such thing as the default. You have people who are single or in different types of relationships, with children, without children. And then, of course, when you look at women, you've got different income earning capacity based on the fact that on average, the jobs that women are in are generally lower paid than the ones men are in, and they generally have more interrupted careers. And a good part of those household relationships do not last, and women find themselves in a situation where they don't have the financial backing to live independently, and they might end up staying in a relationship or otherwise but facing housing poverty and housing insecurity. So basically the economic model kind of is a bit rose-coloured glasses and narrow, and we've got all these, the beauty of human society is we've got this array of all different paths of life, and we don't necessarily have a housing system that's adjustable or flexible or offers different types of housing, the types of homes that are built, the kind of increasingly over time they've always been this, this version of what would be a dream, typical house with a backyard, and it's not necessarily set up in a way to accommodate a diversity of lifestyles or community orientation. And so I think those market forces are exacerbating that over time. But yeah, for the gender gaps, really, it's a reflection of these gender hierarchies in the economy that mean that women's capacity right from the very start are actually on the back foot. I was speaking with some people working in financial services recently, and they're talking about, home loan eligibility and how the research and the data on that, Kate, shows that women are less likely to be given a home loan. And if they are, it's on not as favourable terms and conditions because they're seen as more of a liability because they don't necessarily, on average, have the income stream or the assets to their name, and all these biases which get exacerbated when AI comes into the picture and automates it. So you've got that on right from the get-go in terms of getting a foot in the door in the housing market, or even just applying for rents when you've got a different financial picture based on your gender.
It just becomes so much more complicated. I think kind of talking about the way that households have changed over time as well, and this idea that relationships often dissolve, and we're talking now about, higher levels of divorce or people not partnering at all, but we have this financial model that's really predicated on a nuclear family. There's a real challenge embedded in that. And I think we have a financial system predicated on a nuclear family, but also a housing system that you can't really buy a house in unless you're two incomes. Whereas if we go back a couple of decades, housing was, at a level, was at a cost where it would have been possible to do that on a single wage. So there's these two concurrent things happening where you have smaller households, probably income levels, and those things happening together, I think, with a double issue, like a double negative for people on lower incomes. And that must be part of the pattern too.
Yeah, and I think, as housing, as property developers and that whole industry becomes more and more profit oriented, the more powerful companies have a bigger say in the market and a bigger slice of the market as well. And, their incentive is increase the value of the land, which is often the square meterage of the house, which if you're the female who has to clean the house, you don't necessarily want a bigger house with all these extra rooms and corridors and mezzanines that you just have to clean, right? So the design of the house is very much around profit and what have high resale value rather than what's livable, what's conducive to bringing up a family in a community. There's the potential for, the housing industry to diversify far more in the types of housing products that it puts to market. And maybe this is about sort of going back over decades to realize how housing used to be more about, how do we build communities or amenities and facilities. And the more that you put that in the for-profit hands and that market segmentation dominates, I guess the less you get of this kind of community-oriented, amenities-oriented type of design system. And that's not even thinking about things like security and safety and accessibility to schools or childcare, all those things which, based on current gender patterns, are relatively more important in most cases for women as well. So, yeah, this economic system, it's an interesting one because I think the economists have put forward a case that you rely on the free market and the private sector, it will be more efficient and it will respond to market need and you'll have less blockages in the supply chain. And what we've heard in the last year or so, when there's really been a concerted focus on the construction industry and how to boost productivity and efficiency in the construction industry, it's really placed a spotlight on that supply side chain of decisions and have to be made and pointed out that that's actually still really inefficient, even though it's predominantly like a free market sector. You do have a lot of checks and balances and regulations and quality assurance mechanisms in there for safety, for environmental purposes, etc. But a lot of economists are saying that approvals system is actually really slow as well. I guess government, plays a role there, but it's not necessarily the most efficient it can be in terms of that housing market, supply chain, let alone consulting with what community really needs and what the diversity of the population needs as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's just been so much discussion about falling productivity levels in the development industry over the decades, and the fact that we haven't really innovated in that sector from a construction methodology perspective, but I think also from a community building perspective. Like, just to go back to, I guess, gendered housing outcomes, there's so many international examples of like housing cooperatives and community land trusts and I guess really interesting community-led housing outcomes that you just and that are really quite common in many parts of Europe and many parts of South America, but are just like mind-blowing in an Australian context. And there's just a missed opportunity there.
I think too, we've really got to pay attention to that when we think about aged care and elder care housing as well. So there are great examples overseas, as you say, where that has been designed in very innovative ways to be really inclusive and to have a well-being approach and a health-oriented approach, rather than just saying, okay, the way we've always done it is the right way to do it. There's something interesting too about the construction industry as a sector, because we know it's the type of industry which is very, I'll use the word resistant, like it's not one of those highly adaptable industries. I guess they have new machinery, new technology and that type of thing, but it's also an industry that really place a lot of weight, takes a lot of pride in tradition and status quo and how things have been done. And that is one of the ingredients that makes it more sort of resistant to change in terms of gender equity. We see other industries which are far more inclusive of gender equity have been ones that have inherently been more adaptable, and it's almost like having a personality trait attached to an industry. You know, they're more open-minded, more innovative, where the construction sector, a large part of it, like its social identity is kind of, it takes pride in how it's always done things. What I was also looking at in preparation for our conversation today, Kate, is actually looking at the gender composition of property developers, because it's one thing for us to say we need a gender lens on, you know, these facilities or how housing is designed, but then you've got to think about, well, what's the gender composition of the people who actually make the executive decisions? And so property developers, I had a look, I've got latest census stats for you. So if you look at construction managers in the residential building construction services industry. So we know already that women are in the minority in construction, they're in the minority in manager roles. When we combine all of that together, women make up just 7% of construction managers in residential building. So here we are trying to say that we need to think about gender equality and women's access to housing. And it's not to say that the men in these positions don't care or aren't attuned to this, but when you've got such low representation of the women themselves, it makes it much, much more harder for gender equity considerations to come into the picture of this decision-making framework.
Maybe this takes me to one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which is potentially the value proposition for why we need more women's representation in those roles, is that we are more likely to create housing that women want. But to think more broadly about the value proposition for gender equality, how would you describe that from an economic perspective? Should we care about gender equality? And if we should, what's the economics behind why we should?
Yeah, this is a really big question because, I mean, it comes up all the time. Why should we care about gender equality? And the way I've tried to navigate it or make sense of it, Kate, over time is to look at how that argument has been articulated over the past decades and how it's changed over the past decades as well. I think most listeners would be familiar with, you know, the 1960s and 1970s as being a wave where there were breakthroughs in feminist rights and in women's rights. And it really was a period where we saw a equalization of the playing field, or, you know, leveling of the playing field, correcting for legislation prior to that, which actually stated that women would be paid less, or women weren't allowed to get a bank loan without, you know, a male member of the family approving. So that was like, you know, inequality was written into law. We had to undo that, dismantle those overt barriers. And that was very much a human rights, values-based period. And it was in keeping with the international movements that were very much driven, you know, by UN Women and international rights organizations. And then what we saw, I guess this coincides with like the 1980s 80s, 1990s, where it really was an eruption of free market capitalism as well. You know, in most Western economies, and including in Australia, we had a lot of deregulation. We had this productivity boom because of kind of breaking off or breaking down what were impediments to the free market, you know, like floating of the dollar and that type of deregulation movement. And then what we also saw at that time in terms of women's rights was very much like this corporate case that we need more women in the workforce. Why? Because we just need more workers, and women, you know, the women are at home, but you know what? You can carry a baby and a briefcase at the same time and step into corporate culture, and it's the shoulder pads and it's the, you know, you can do it. And it was very much individualized. It was women, you can be successful, be confident. So much of that messaging, I don't know if you got exposed to that as well, Kate.
I should say, just on this topic, I don't mean to talk over you, but the lean in argument about individual, like Sheryl Sandberg lean in argument, is actually the reason I got my first job in academia, because I had just read this. I'd read this book and her making this comment about how men are likely to apply for a job if they meet 50% of the criteria, and women need to meet 100% of it. It was this very individualistic kind of framing of feminism. And at the time I read it and I hadn't moved on to my next wave of feminism in my life yet. And I was like, oh my God, this is the answer. And this job came up for a postdoc, and I hadn't finished my PhD. But I was like, well, if I was a man, I'd apply for this postdoc. So I applied and I got the job. So I always think that maybe inadvertently individualistic feminism is why I have the career I have. But I have moved on in my thinking since then. But sorry, I cut you off.
No, it's a great example, because I thought the same too. Like, I read this book and I genuinely thought, this is really interesting, because I'd like to measure, as an economist, I'd like to figure out when women's confidence increases, by how much is that going to improve and bump up their job promotion prospects and their pay, right? So I conducted an analysis of this, and I think it was speaking to the fact, like, a motivational pep talk, you know, for some women, it can push you over the line. But is it really going to close these decades of social inequity and, you know, change the gender biases in the system? So, but yeah, I think that's why it was so favorably received, because I think women thought, okay, I do feel empowered by this, you know, we can make some gains. But when you look at the research more broadly, you realize, no, that's not going to be your answer. And often it's women who probably, maybe like you, Kate, were like destined anyway to
there's privilege there. Yeah.
To actually you know, go after your dreams. And this was like validation of that. Yeah, that period though was really this notion, and people will hear terminology or words like, we've just got to unlock women's potential. We've just got to tap into this untapped talent pool. We've got to unleash, you know, this talent, this underutilized part of our workforce. Now, for most women, you're not underutilized. You're actually at home doing most of the unpaid work and care with very little free time at all. It's not like you're sitting around idly. And yet this corporate culture, which I think it kept going from the 1990s into the, you know, early 2000s, which was, we just need more women in the economy. We need more women in STEM. We need more women in finance. We need more women in construction trades. These are all for-profit industries that needed more workers. And they were thinking, yeah, who's untapped? You've got to really ask, you know, who's locked up the women's talents in the first place? Who's doing the unlocking here? There's so many complications to that, you know, that terminology and that analogy. And so this gave rise to this business case, which was seeing women's talents as something to be extracted and to profit from and to bring into the corporate space. And it was going to boost productivity. It was going to boost innovation. It was going to boost basically your performance measures, which I think is partly contributed to why a lot of men feel they're not necessarily on board here. They feel quite resistant to the whole gender equity movement, because it's basically saying what the men are offering is not sufficient, and there's some sort of missing void here, and we've got to bring the women in to complete that picture. So you can sort of see the seeds for a field where resistance could grow because of this business case proposition. So instead of it being human rights based and a matter of equity and equality and inclusion as a matter of social justice and a human right, it now has become very much a corporate proposition that we need women in the paid workforce to boost basically the economic outcomes of organisations or governments. Now, there is research that does detect that you do have this correlation between like more diverse teams and more problem solving and more innovation. But where part of that mechanism lies is not necessarily the women themselves, but just the diversity of views that have come in, and also the culture of an organisation. If it's more inclusive, if it's more diverse, it's more inclusive, it's probably better for psychological safety and well-being, and therefore all workers, all people involved are actually performing at a better level, because it's a sign of the culture rather than necessarily the individual contribution of the underrepresented and marginalized groups. So there's all these complexities of the business case, and the business case I think is still alive and well in terms of what people arguing for gender equality, and partly you can understand it because we've kind of been forced to speak that language or communicate the value of gender equity in this currency based on who we're talking to, these decision makers. So really the next chapter, the next unfolding of this gender equality progressive journey is to realize that, gender equity means gender equity in decision makers, not just the people being employed, but the people, building the architecture and the systems and the policies. And not to mention too, of course, the benefits for men weren't part of that business case proposition. They were squeezed out of that picture. And what we know is that it's gender norms and gender stereotypes that are harmful for all genders, including men. And so that well-being piece, needs to be part of this next picture as well.
Which leads me to a very big question, which is, if you were designing economic policy for gender equality, but even if we're going beyond gender equality, that broader well-being piece that you're talking about, what kinds of things would you be focusing on?
Oh my gosh, that's a massive question. I think, look, where we can get the greatest gains, Kate, is not necessarily the one-off policies, the discrete policies, although they've been really, really important. It's bringing that gender lens into the process. I've referred before to gender lensing, and this is this idea that in the course of designing a policy or deciding where resources are allocated, where money is spent, we pause and we apply a gender lens to it, and we think, is this decision going to widen the gender gaps, the gender disparities we care about, or is it going to narrow them? So in government budget making, we think about this a lot now in terms of gender responsive budgeting. So that's recently been introduced. Actually, we don't think about it a lot. We focus on the budget as a potential area where this gender budgeting should apply. And the Australian government has recently brought it back. Victorian government has progressed it. But it's still a very volatile policy. If there's a change of sentiment amongst the government, then it could sort of fall away. So I would say the gender lens, bringing that gender lens architecture into policy making is kind of your mechanism to ensure that, someone's basically sitting around the table and say, hey, what about the gender component here? You build it into the requirement. It's also a way of building in more accountability to your decision making. So if you think about government policy servicing the whole of the community and women's share of that, and if women's experiences aren't considered during the policy making process, are you really being accountable to the population you're meant to serve? So it can be argued on that basis as well. And then I would say partly, and by extension, it's also making sure we have women in decision-making roles. So I often don't call it leadership as such, but just decision-making. And you'll hear the term women's economic empowerment, and often we assume that economic empowerment for women means having a paid job, having a bank account, having some sort of financial security, and they're all important components. But economics, if you were to define economics, this is the way I talk about economics to my students. Economics is actually about decision making. It's the science of decision making. So women's economic empowerment means women are part of the decision makers. So until we get to that point, I don't think we can say we've got women's economic empowerment. We've got women integrated and participating in the economic system and contributing their talents and their skill and their labour and their time, in the same way men are. But are they necessarily shaping the architecture and the systems and the policy leaders? And as we circle back to the start of the conversation, who's designing these new property developments? Who's designing who's eligible for a home loan or not? Who's designing urban transport systems to cater for the fact that the way that women move throughout the day involves several transits in all different directions rather than just from the home to the CBD and back again? Who's designing work from home policies which would enable far more flexibility to work and live in the regions rather than all have to congregate into a CBD? We have to make sure we've got that inclusive voice around those decision-making circles. And to me, that's women's empowerment.
Yes, that makes so much sense. And thank you for such a coherent answer to what was such a wildly large question. So I think you did well on coming back to that idea of process and participation and empowerment within that. I have two final questions, if that's okay, that I ask everyone. They're like little shorties, which I think it's interesting to see the similarities we get across them. So one of them is what I'm calling vibing and venting. So that's, what is one thing you're really vibing in gender and housing at the moment? And what is one thing that you really need to vent about?
Oh, the vibing bit. What am I excited about? Honestly, to start with, when I saw this question, I thought, I don't know if I'm terribly optimistic or confident about
Oh, no.
housing at the moment. I'm sorry, Kate, but not to be a dampener, but I think you mentioned before about the international examples proving that what is possible. I think that gives us hope. But where I honestly think there's more opportunity or more prospect for us making ground in terms of gender equity is when we fuse gender equity in housing with some of the other real big, wicked problems, including climate change and well-being. So if you look at climate change at the moment, it's a key factor behind inflation and prices going up, but also particularly for insurance. So you think about housing, you think about people actually not only not being able to afford a home, but not being able to afford the insurance that they need behind that home because they're now increasingly exposed to climate change disasters and more severe ones. So what we kind of observe in terms of where progress is made, it's often when gender equity is wrapped up in another really important issue. And so you're going to see climate change insurance become even more of a big issue for companies, for investors, for the big decision makers, current decision makers, and governments. So I think that's a window of opportunity to realise that we need to take that inclusive approach, an equitable approach to insurance and housing, and realise that we've got this, this threat of, it's currently here, this climate change risk that is creating economic inequity across the housing market, but also in terms of, people's, where you live, is it now a risk factor depending on if you can get insurance and all the risk assessments that go into, geographic location as well. So maybe that's a window for us to, look towards. I would really like to see more endorsement of working from home as well, because I think that is a circuit breaker that enables more participation in the paid workforce, particularly for women and people with caregiving, without the necessity to commute. And that could also mitigate against some of these really challenging housing affordability problems and create more inclusive, opportunities for people who live in outer suburbs and regions as well.
Yeah, I do.
Sorry,
I
that
see.
was more than one thing. Sorry.
That's all right. You're allowed to. Was there something you wanted to vent about, or have we touched off on that already?
Oh, I went to vent as well. I think the vent was kind of intertwined into all of that, how the current systems are not are lacking that gender equity lens, and lacking that well-being lens. This is quality of life. Housing is not just a roof over your head. It's a sense of where you belong and community and psychological safety. So, getting back to the core of what housing constitutes, going back to that, human rights, human needs, not a business case of what it is a for-profit investment, and making it less of an asset class and more of a essential need.
Absolutely. And then the final question, which is, if you could describe a genuinely gender equitable housing future, what would it look like?
Well, I guess we wouldn't have this housing affordability crisis that we currently see. One of the real concerns about the current housing situation is that it's really closely linked to, I've just mentioned, this could be a sensitive issue for some listeners, it's closely linked to the incidence of domestic violence and intimate partner violence as well, because of women. In most cases it is women, but if there's a partner who wants and needs to be able to separate or flee a relationship or a household, they can't always, because of financial reasons, and they can't seek safe accommodation. And so often it's the crisis and refuge centres that are the ones that are in, there's too much need and too much demand and not enough supply or attention placed on that. So I think for gender equitable housing, yes, we can look at overall home ownership and retirement and making sure everyone's living with a stable roof over their head and it's not determined by gender. But I think what's a very, very live issue at the moment is just how that neglect of housing equity and housing opportunities is contributing to the terrible outcomes for many women in terms of still being subjected to domestic violence. So a gender equitable housing future would mean that we have safe and secure and independent housing for women and anyone fleeing domestic violence, gender-based violence, so that they do not find themselves in that situation.
Yeah, that's a beautiful vision. And should not be so hard to achieve. That feels like the bare minimum of what a housing system should achieve, but it hasn't changed. Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it, and for kind of following along the logic of a range of different questions. I think that was amazing. But yeah, is there anything that you want to say while we're here?
Oh, yeah, thank you, Kate. I guess that I did have one point there, because it'd be interesting to think about how to reconcile what we've discussed with the typical answer when economists are asked, what do we need to do to solve the housing crisis? And I could say, just briefly, one or two things about that, because like 99%, if not 100% of economists would say supply side, we need more supply, right? And we need to break down those inefficiencies and approvals, which we kind of touched on. But I think too, if you look bigger picture at that, yes, it's supply, and there are debates about how much difference it would make to change, say, capital gains tax or negative gearing, and would that free up more property so that more people could shift from being a renter to being an owner occupant. So there's different economic modelling that suggests that, could make a difference or it might not make a difference at all, right? So that we've got those types of policy levers that people are kind of looking at potentially shifting or tinkering with, and we know there's a lot of political volatility attached to those types of decisions as well. So even if it was economically promising, you wouldn't necessarily get a government go down that path. But a broader picture here is also to recognise how housing in Australia has become such an attractive investment and asset class. It's stable, people can see it, they can touch it, it's at scale, it's seen as sort of an aspiration that you don't just buy a home and live in a home, but you acquire more. And that's sort of starting to build into the Australian psyche of success and aspiration. You have several homes to your name, because it's an asset class that's within reach. And often it's what you've seen other people invest in. So it's familiar, you know how it works, it's, really stable. So one way to kind of mitigate against this shortage of supply relative to, people looking at housing as an asset class rather than something they're going to live in is to also think about how do we encourage Australians to look at a range of other assets to invest in. So they're not just gravitating towards property market and housing. We have such an underinvestment in this country in businesses and startups and new products and entrepreneurs and creative enterprises and sometimes it's hard to get the scale, but people are crying out for venture capital, to build their business, to expand. So many talented people across all types of businesses, particularly for women as well. Women make up such a small percentage of recipients of venture capital. So you've got this whole other world out there where there's other ways to invest your money. Now, clearly that's much less stable. There's much more risk involved than buying bricks and mortar or investing in bricks and mortar. But there's an avenue there to look at, well, how can we create more systems where it's like maybe more collective investment? So you pull the risk, but then you sort of share the returns. But we really need more capital investment in businesses and not-for-profits and community groups where there's social impact, there's for-profit returns. You can scale up, move into the international export market. It's just another world. And I don't know what it would take, but it would be great in the future, down the track, to see how Australian households don't just think of bricks and mortar or shares in existing big, ASX companies, but think in a more diverse way of how we can really back small businesses, entrepreneurs, creative inventions. And it probably would need to be done in a pooled way. Obviously, it's you wouldn't want people going alone and suffering the risk, but yeah, maybe that's something I would genuinely say is untapped and can be tapped into, but that takes a bit of a mind shift and sort of changing some of that architecture as well. So there's more solutions maybe than we've thought about.
I really love that positive framing because I feel like so often the response to changing tax settings to reduce that continuing increase in house prices is like, well, people will just move their money right into other sectors. And maybe the response is, well, yeah, exactly. That's what we want to see. And there's all of these positive flow-on effects from that process. So I'm so glad you came back to that. I think that's an important thing to have as part of this discussion.
Thanks. Yeah. And I think too, we're often trapped in a zero-sum game where it's either renters or, renters depending on investors or owners. And yes, we're trying to grow the pie, we're trying to expand housing supply, but then that's really hamstrung by inputs. And do we have enough construction workers or enough inputs into that? So that's not going to be your solution. So how do we look elsewhere in our economy where we actually need capital and investment? And part of the job of economists is to have that big picture bird's eye view and think about, well, how do we redirect capital and resources across the economy away from where maybe we don't need it as much to where we do need it? We haven't joined the dots really along the lines of what I was describing before, but it moves us out of a zero-sum game to think about how do we equalise where there's a shortage here, there's a need over there. So, it's a bit more like a push and pull that will balance out and solve two problems at once rather than a zero-sum competitive battle.
That to me was the most remarkable experience I've ever had because it was about changing minds, but also changing hearts.
On next week's episode of Homes Not Houses, I'll be joined by Canadian policy expert Professor Carolyn Weitzman to talk about how we can change people's hearts and minds on this issue. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again next time. This series is a production of Per Capita, the independent progressive think tank dedicated to fighting inequality in Australia. We work to build a new vision for Australia based on fairness, shared prosperity, community, and social justice, and we are committed to providing ad-free and editorially independent content. This season is proudly sponsored by the YWCA and Australians Investing in Women, whose support helped produce the show and our research. Homes Not Houses was produced on the lands of the Wurundjeri-Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present.